Good morning, everybody. How are you doing today? This is the last lecture of the semester. I hope you're as sad as I am. I've had a lot of fun this semester meeting you folks and talking to you. But this is the end of the road, and all of you will be Psychology 150 graduates in less than a week. So, tell me, how's everything going? Anybody got anything to add, anything to tell me about today? If you do, just go ahead and type up there in the top chat bar and let me know. Quickly, I just wanted to let you know that I have updated the review for the final exam in Blackboard. So if you go to the exam folder, hopefully you can see that in your screen right now. If you go to the exam folder, what you'll see is that I have excuse me. Ooh, I goofed it up. What you should see is the final exam review. We've got 60 questions, 60 minutes. 20 of those questions will be cumulative, and 40 of them will come from the latest material that we've covered, chapters 12 through 15. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit so you can see. I've got some items from chapter 1, some items from chapter 2, some items from chapter 6, and some items from chapter 7. And these will be the cumulative parts. And you can expect probably 7 to 8 biology questions, 4 or 5 areas of specialization question, and then the others will be on behaviorism and cognitive psychology. Any questions so far with that? Hi, Amanda. Good morning to you. Fantastic. KB is reviewing the brain structures from Chapter 2. I'm doing well, Donnie. I've got some work to do around the house today. I've got to fix a couple of light fixtures that need replacing on the outside. I hate doing construction work, but got to do it. Okay, looks like it's 11:01. We've probably got our audience here. If anybody wants to check in and say hello, good morning to you. Renee has not texted me on Remind yet, so she may not be here today. It's a bummer. Alex G., good morning to you too. Fantastic. So if you would, type in the chat bar, what is it that you folks like about the live lectures? You've been coming pretty regularly, and I'm trying to get a feel for how I'm going to do this in the fall. And so I'm just curious, what is the value that you find from this particular format? As you type your answers in, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So today, Renee's laughing at me. She did text me. I just didn't get it. I'm sorry. I had my headphones on my... Let's see. Oh, you sure did. Goodness me. Good morning to you, Renee. I am so sorry. She gave me a sad face, and now I feel bad. Uh-oh. I'll have to work hard to save the morning. Good morning, Amber. Good to see you, too. All right, so we're going to talk about the second half of Chapter 15 today. If you remember, yesterday we focused mainly on talk therapies and mainly on one form of talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, which combines operant and classical conditioning methods to change behaviors along with cognitive restructuring to retrain us into healthier habits of thinking. Very good. Thank you for that feedback. Actually, I'll spend more time looking at that. I'm having trouble processing it all in my mind right now, but thank you very much, KB. All right, so what we're going to talk about today are biological treatments. Remember, I suggested to you that you have talk therapy and you have biological treatments. And then I also suggested to you this idea of the eclectic theory, which is the idea that most clinical psychologists, they're going to give you some medication, but there's also going to be some talk therapy involved. A lot of times if you go in there for talk therapy, they may ask you to take some medication as well, but usually we're going to hit you with both of these. But today we're going to talk a little bit about neurotransmitters and how psychotropic drugs work, and then we're going to talk about psychotropic drugs within the context of the 3 disorders that we covered in Chapter 14, bipolar disorder, mood disorders, and schizophrenia. Okay, and then we're going to talk about other biological treatments. Let's go ahead and get started, if we could. All right, so if you'll remember from Chapter 2, we talked about neurotransmitters as being those molecules that allow neurons to communicate with one another at the microscopic level between synapses. Remember, we said no 2 neurons actually touch. They're very close to touching, but they communicate with these chemical transmitters. I then suggested to you that psychotropic drugs, either prescription or the ones you'll find on the street, are what we call neuromodulators. And basically, these are just molecules that affect the synaptic functioning of neurotransmitters. And I suggest, and you know what, actually, there are neuromodulators that exist within your brain as well. But what we're going to talk about really are the neuromodulatory effects of these prescription drugs, and I'm just going to suggest to you that in general, neuromodulators work in one of 2 ways. Either they work to magnify the effect of the neurotransmitter, and we'll call them agonists, all right? And some neuromodulators, psychotropic drugs, work against the impact of a specific neurotransmitter, preventing it from working at the level of the synapse. Now, what we know, what we believe is that somehow or another chemical imbalances in the brain are related to psychiatric disorders. And so there is a history of research that's looked into how different chemicals can affect these different neurotransmitter levels in the brain. And I will take you back and say the first neuromodulator ever invented was Thorazine back in 1952. Before that, if you had schizophrenia, there was only one way they really could treat you, and that was with a frontal lobotomy. And so they would actually take ice picks and shove them up underneath your eyes, and they would send them into your frontal lobe and actually separate your frontal lobe from the rest of your brain. And this was the way that they controlled the behavior of people who were uncontrollable with schizophrenia. And in fact, the invention of Thorazine led to the first mass deinstitutionalization in psychiatric history, because Thorazine controlled people's hallucinations and delusions. If you're hallucinating or having delusions, that's when you have to be kept against your will in an institution. But the drug Thorazine seemed to work to decrease the hallucinations and delusions, and it led to this mass deinstitutionalization. Now, I will tell you right here as a caveat, and again, if you hear a biopsych's opinion that differs from mine, go with the biopsych opinion. But from what I can tell, reading up about all of these neuromodulatory drugs that they use to help treat people's psychological disorders, they really don't understand how they work, physiologically. And the weird thing is, neurotransmitters that work one way in one part of the brain work a different way in a different part of the brain. So if you look at this picture I've got down here on the right, it shows you the 4 different dopamine pathways that exist in the brain. And each of these dopamine pathways uses that neurotransmitter, but uses it in a different way. And so when we give people drugs that affect a neurotransmitter in one area of the brain, you have to understand that that neurotransmitter is going to work, that neuromodulating drug is going to work on neurotransmitters in other parts of the brain. So we really don't understand how these neurotransmitters work in different parts of the brain. We just know that they seem to have positive behavioral effects and lower and side effects which aren't too dangerous. But we really don't 100% know exactly how these SSRIs are working in every part of the brain. It's kind of scary actually to think that we're giving people these very powerful psychotropic drugs without complete knowledge of how they're working inside the brain. Very good. Thank you, Amanda, and I will think about that comment after class too. I appreciate the feedback. Now, so just keep that in mind. So even though we use these drugs and they're very useful, we still don't know exactly what they're doing because neurotransmitter functioning in the brain is super complicated, right? Now, bipolar, I will start real quickly with dopamine pathways and bipolar. One particular drug, one disorder that does seem to respond well to drug treatment is bipolar disorders. In fact, your book's going to suggest that one of the best known treatment routines and treatment protocols for psychological disorders exists for bipolar disorders. And what they do is they give you these mood stabilizing drugs, this mood stabilizing drug called lithium. And I've actually looked in the literature, and the literature says they don't exactly know how lithium works to to stabilize your mood. They just know that lithium does. Now, I'm sure all of you have seen in the news, if you're like me and you follow pop culture, you've seen that Kanye West is having he's having a manic episode. He apparently is bipolar, and he appears to be having a manic episode. And some of the things he's saying are actually quite psychotic, if you will, and detached from reality. So what you're going to notice is that what they do with bipolar disorder is if you have type 2 bipolar disorder, they're usually going to add they're usually going to add antipsychotics to people who are taking a bipolar disorder because that helps the delusions and the hallucinations that go along with the manic episode. Now, you'll notice down here it says if you have type 2 bipolar, that means the major symptoms of your disorder of your bipolar is depressive episodes, then what they'll do is they'll give you an antidepressant. So typically with bipolar disorder, you're going to take the mood stabilizing lithium. And if you're type 1, they're going to give you the Seroquel, which is the antipsychotic. And both of these are going to work on dopamine levels. And then if you are bipolar 2, they'll add the antidepressant. Although in the literature it does say that you have to be careful because sometimes the antidepressant can actually trigger a manic episode. How interesting is that, right? Now, the one thing I also have heard is that lithium is kind of dangerous. The amount that is therapeutic is kind of close to the amount that can be dangerous for you. So from what I've understood in talking to clinical psychologists is that you kind of edge up. You sort of start with a low level of the lithium and keep going up and up and up until you find the level that works for the patient because you don't want to give them too much. It's all electrochemical, sounds exactly balanced. It's much an art. Yes, actually, but the thing is the science, Ken, is so primitive right now. And we think we know a lot, and we think we have a lot of chemicals and drugs to help people, but really our understanding of the complex functioning of 100 billion electrochemical cells is really in its infancy stage. And by infancy, I mean, think about in terms of decades or centuries. You know, we've just really started studying neurochemical functioning here in the last 40 or 50 years. And so I would say it's a relatively new science. And if you go back to the resources folder that I've got and look at the treatments that were used in the early 1920s and 30s, you will be shocked at the medieval nature of how we used to treat schizophrenia back in the 20s or 30s. We would use electroshock therapy. We would use insulin. We would overdose people on insulin so they would go into shock. They would wrap people in wet blankets. They would put them in warm showers. And these were all psychiatric treatments. There you go. Ken obviously went and looked at that video, and the folder. It's pretty crazy, isn't it? And that's less than 100 years ago. That's how we treated mental illness. So we've moved along, but still don't think we've figured it out. Okay, now, I'd like to talk briefly about serotonin and depression. Depression is very important because it's the most common psychological disorder that people suffer. And your book actually suggests that almost 10% of 12 to 17-year-old kids have had a major depressive episode. And you know what? People who are depressed engage in irresponsible drug use or sometimes commit suicide. And if you look in the CDC's list causes of death, what you're going to find is that behind accidents, car accidents involving alcohol, suicide is the second leading cause of death in adolescence. So adolescent depression is a very important thing, and anybody who's ever suffered from depression knows it's something terrible that you need to be treated for. And so your book's going to talk about about MAOIs and SSRIs, so monoamine oxidase inhibitors and selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And both of these kinds of drugs work by magnifying the serotonin in your brain. What they do is they prevent it from being sucked back up into the terminal buttons so that it sort of keeps sending messages multiple times to the same receptor sites. And so this magnifies the amount of serotonin in your brain. And your books right here is going to sort of show you the gender difference that we see in depression here in the teenage years, with females suffering higher rates of depression than males. And the only problem is research has shown that when adolescents take antidepressants like Zoloft, Paxil, some of these others, that teenagers tend to think about suicide more. They don't necessarily do it more, but there's more suicidal ideation. And people who study suicide know that the first step towards on this path to committing suicide is beginning to think about it seriously. So there is a risk associated with giving antidepressants to kids, to teenagers. Now, your book mentions this idea of the teenage depression study, and this was a study to assess the effectiveness of treatment methods for adolescent depression. Different ways you can go with depression. You can use CBT, like we talked about yesterday, or you can use drug therapy. And the reason I'm talking about this graph is because this graph kind of shows what we might call the eclectic approach, and how the eclectic approach may lead to better outcomes than just using one or the other. And so what they did was they compared children who were diagnosed as depressed. They gave them nothing, which is the placebo condition. They gave them CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. They gave them Prozac, or they used what we might call the eclectic method, giving them Prozac and CBT. And this graph represents the number of patients that showed improvement in 12 and 36 weeks. And what you'll see is that the best outcomes were associated with the combined use of CBT and the medication, especially early on in the treatment process. So if you want a quicker impact, you need to use both of these together. But I will point out that the CBT therapy did become almost as effective as the combined therapy, especially at 36 weeks, 9 months later. However, the problem with CBT and talk therapy is it's time intensive. it's expensive, and it requires that the patient be willing to complete the course of therapy, right? And so that's sort of the downside. If you could get the kid into the doctor's office and talking and going through cognitive behavioral therapy and working on it really hard, and you had the money and the resources, your outcomes are going to be almost as good as if you give that kid the medicine. However, your insurance company wants the cheaper direction, and so what they're usually going to do is send you to the drug therapy because it works more quickly. Now, I want to point out your drug therapy for schizophrenia, and we believe that schizophrenia is related to dopamine levels. There's something called the dopamine hypothesis tested in the 70s and 80s, and it turns out they found that amphetamines and other drugs that magnify the amount of dopamine in your system tend to increase psychotic symptoms, and drugs that impair dopamine functioning in the brain seem to decrease the amount of hallucinations and delusions that people had, decrease the psychotic behavior. And so it was generally agreed that dopamine is the causal factor in schizophrenic symptoms. Now, I want to point out real quickly that when we talk about schizophrenia, you can sort of group the symptoms into what we would call positive symptoms and negative symptoms. We call them positive symptoms because there's something added in. So a delusion is something new that you didn't have before. A hallucination is something new that you didn't have before. So we call those positive symptoms. And then the other sets of symptoms we'll call negative symptoms because they're sort of the loss of things. So you're going to get lack of energy, lethargy, and loss of emotional sharpness, if you will, emotional blunting. So these are the negative symptoms. Now, the reason I tell you that is because Thorazine, one of the first antipsychotics developed, was what we called a typical antipsychotic. It was called an antipsychotic. They invented later ones called atypical antipsychotic. So the typical antipsychotic, like Thorazine, the earliest ones created, reduced the positive symptoms. They didn't really do anything about the lack of energy or emotional functioning, but they at least made the hallucinations or delusions go away, right? And so this was very important for allowing tons of people to get out of the institutions, like I mentioned earlier. The only problem with using these using these antipsychotics that affect dopamine functioning is that dopamine functioning is also implicated in behavioral tics and smooth motor movements. And so it turns out that when people take these typical antipsychotics, sometimes, about 20% of the time, they develop this side effect called tardive dyskinesia. I didn't put any videos of it in the folder, but if you want to Google that, go to YouTube and type tardive dyskinesia. There are plenty of videos that will show you this mainly facial behavioral tic that you're going to see in some people who take schizophrenia. Now, it can develop in other ways. It can develop based on degradation of a dopamine pathway. But what I'm saying is the side effect for schizophrenia is that it sometimes leads to this behavioral tic. Now, the problem with tardive dyskinesia is it's not always permanent, but stopping the drug doesn't necessarily make it go away. Once you have tardive dyskinesia, from what I understand, stopping the medication is not necessarily going to make the symptoms go away. So there is a newer brand of antipsychotics. They're called the atypical antipsychotics. They have names like Risperidol and Seroquel. And these drugs are less likely to result in dyskinesia. From what I've read, dyskinesia can still occur, but it's less likely using these atypical antipsychotics. And your book's going to say that they are more effective in reducing negative symptoms, although the literature is the outside literature that you'll read on atypical antipsychotics doesn't 100% agree with that. But the idea is that they may reduce some of these negative symptoms, giving you back your emotion and your feeling of energy. And you'll see I have graphs here on the right that are in your textbook, and they show you the effects that conventional antipsychotic drugs have on positive symptoms, and a study showing the effect that atypical antipsychotic drugs have on negative symptoms. And you'll see that over time, the use of these drugs lead to a decrease in either the positive or the negative symptoms compared to controls, people who didn't get these medications. Okay, now I'm not going to talk about this much, but I just want to point you to this table in your book. Take a look at it, because what I think is neat about it is it's going to kind of give you the classes of disorders. It's going to show you the drugs that are typically used in those, the treatments used for those disorders, the drugs types that are associated with these disorders, and some of the trade names, so that you might be familiar with some of these drug names. And it also gives you the typical side effects, because remember, these neurotransmitter affecting drugs aren't just working on the neurotransmitters we want. They're working on other neurotransmitters that we synaptic sites that we don't necessarily want them to work at, right? And so this is kind of a for your interest type of thing. And the weird thing is, you may be taking a drug that reads here as an antipsychotic, and you might say, oh my God, I only had a learning disorder, or I might only have had attention deficit disorder. Why are they giving me an antipsychotic drug? And don't think of it as an antipsychotic drug. It just happens to be a drug that affects whatever symptoms you have. Maybe it helps you focus, which is part of not being psychotic. So it might work for ADD as well as psychosis. You know what I mean? So don't get hung up if you see one of these drug names that you or a friend may be taking for one disorder and you don't have that disorder, because they sort of use these drugs across some of these disorders. I hope that makes sense. I do. Now, the one final point that I want to make before I let you go, we're running out of time, is there are other therapies that can be used based on how we know the brain works. Now, it's not all about chemical functioning, although a lot of drug therapies are based on that theory. Keep in mind that the brain also generates electrical activity, and electrical activity is what stimulates neurons and what depresses neuron areas. So you can use your knowledge of the electrical properties of the brain to also create therapies that help people. Now I'm going to start with a non-electrical therapy called psychosurgery. The frontal lobotomy, Ken, I forgot that. Yes, I did put the Walter Freeman documentary in the course resources folder about the frontal lobotomy. The frontal lobotomy was invented in 1938, and for about 30 years, it was a very popular treatment for people with schizophrenia and people with behavioral control problems. And what they would do is they would take, actually in the early ones, they took ice picks or really thin knives. They would use electroconvulsive therapy to knock you out, right, so that you were kind of unconscious. Then they would take these long, thin knives and they pick your eyelid up and they stick them underneath your eye and to the orbital bone there, and they take a little hammer and knock it through, and they send these knives up into your frontal lobe, and they skewer them left and right like this, and basically they would slice off your frontal lobe and separate it from the rest of your brain. And this would oftentimes calm people down who were psychotic or had behavioral control problems. And it was a scary time in American psychiatry. Right? Rose Kennedy was given the frontal lobotomy, an embarrassment for the Kennedy clan. And so this is what they used before they even understood drug therapy. Now, the frontal lobotomy is not used anymore. I don't even know if I don't know if I want to say the words outlawed, but just it's not used. However, there are some types of psychosurgery that are used when people are having psychological disorders that require some sort of biological intervention. And the one that I'm going to talk about to you is the commissurotomy, which is used to treats people with severe seizures that don't respond to medication. Now, commissurotomy is when you slice the corpus callosum in half. But what they do is they do not slice the entire corpus callosum in half. From what I understand, I think they leave the back part called the splenum. They leave you a little bit of that corpus callosum, but they cut most of it, they sever it, so that the electrical stimulation that is a seizure can't travel from one side of the brain to the other. And it appears to decrease the frequency and severity of seizures. Now, if you look back at electroconvulsive, or what we call shock therapy, it has almost as bad a reputation as frontal lobotomy has. And in fact, if you'll watch the video that I provide in the course resources folder, what they'll suggest to you is that they use these electroconvulsive shock therapy in conjunction with the frontal lobotomy. So they would use the electroconvulsive shock to knock you out. So electroconvulsive therapy has a really bad reputation, and you would think about having to hold the person down or strap them down with rubber belts to keep them from bouncing around. And actually, people used to get hurt and maybe sprain and wrench their back and hurt their bodies because of the electroconvulsive therapy. What they do now is they give you drugs. They give you a drug to sort of make you flaccid. I forget what you would call that drug. But it kind of sort of a muscle relaxant, thank you, so that when they shock you, you don't thrash about as much. But apparently, electroconvulsive therapy can be useful in treating people with severe depression. If you go look at the literature, you're going to find some people think it's great, some people think it's the worst thing that's ever been used. I'm just going to tell you that it sometimes is used for treating people with severe depression. And if anybody's interested, I actually didn't include this because I didn't want to put too many videos in the resources folder. I've got a lady with depression so severe that she almost seems psychotic. And I have a video of her 2 minutes before the 2 minutes of discussion before electroconvulsive therapy, and then 2 minutes of discussion about a week after she did electroconvulsive therapy. And it's hard to imagine it's the same person. It is super duper shocking. If anybody's interested in that, send me a text and I'll be happy to share that video with you. Right? Transcranial magnetic stimulation. We talked about that in the biopsych chapter. One of the neat things with TMS is you can actually use that to create temporary lesions in the brain where you cut off, you use these magnets to actually deactivate a part of the brain, and we can use that to experimentally study what different areas of the brain engage in. And sort of that's a research purpose for transcranial magnetic stimulation. It turns out that TMS also has a clinical application, and research has shown that it's also effective in treating depression, right? And then I put this video probably, goodness me, I think this video might have been in chapter 2, but I talked about Bianca Suarez. She is the most severe case of Tourette syndrome ever in the world. And what they did was they put a pacemaker deep into her basal ganglia, which is down there below her thalamus, and they used this pacemaker to send regular volts of electricity into this part of our brain that wasn't functioning well enough. And this caused the Tourette's to go away, because the basal ganglia kind of keeps you from these behavioral tics. Remember, I suggested with the dopamine hypothesis that an area down in your basal ganglia gets disrupted by the antipsychotic drugs. You can use electrical activity to stimulate different parts of the brain. And deep brain stimulation is used for Parkinson's, Tourette's, obsessive compulsive disorder, dystonia, any disorder that's related to behavioral tics can be improved using deep brain stimulation. You know, Donnie does bring up a good point. I assume you're talking about the frontal lobotomy. It's weird to think how they came up to it. You just have to, I just don't think we really appreciate how ignorant of what was going on in the brain they were even 70 years ago in the 1940s. You would just be absolute shocked at how little we knew about the brain functioning. I don't think I forget when they even discovered DNA or neurotransmitters. I think we're talking 40s and 50s. So we really knew very little about the brain. And I would say that a ton of our knowledge has come from computer technologies, imaging technologies, and other things that have allowed us to actually look inside the black box, Donnie. But yeah, it is crazy that somebody said, hey, what if we take a knife and just cut off part of the brain? It's far-fetched to be sure, right? Okay, I don't know what else to say. I just want you to know drug therapies work by interfering or augmenting our neurotransmitter functioning. Remember, they do that systemically and not specifically. So all of these neurotransmitter affecting drugs are going to have unintended side effects. The best treatment, probably the clearest treatment protocol that we have, is for treating bipolar disorder, and it usually involves lithium and either antipsychotics if you're bipolar 1 or lithium and antidepressants if you're bipolar 2. Most depression treatments, or all depression treatments, work by amplifying the serotonin levels in our brain. Depression is the most common disorder, psychological disorder that people have. However, there are some questions about the effectiveness of using drug therapy for treatment when you can use cognitive behavioral therapy and get the same kind of effect, especially with the known side effect that depression leads people to think about self-harm, right? Now, antipsychotics work against dopamine functioning in the brain, but they have this annoying side effect, this behavioral tic that begins to plague you, some people who take the antipsychotics. So we have two different kinds of antipsychotics, your typical and your atypical. And your atypical antipsychotics may have the advantage of working on negative symptoms as well, and they are also less likely to cause the tardive dyskinesia. And then finally, I want you to know that a lot of biological treatments that we use take advantage also of the electrical properties of the brain. I don't know if you have any questions, but that's all I really wanted to share today. It's been great talking to you folks over the course of the semester. I've really enjoyed these lectures. I'm going to go back and read your comments carefully to figure out exactly what it was you liked about my lectures so I can do more of that next semester. If you come up with any other ideas, I'm more than happy to listen to remind suggestions or emailed suggestions, critiques, what you didn't like, things you did like that I need to do more of, anything. Think of it as a way to help the next class out. Right? So it's 11:37. I've kept you too long as always, right? So I'm going to let you go, and I hope to see you in tomorrow's Friday webinar, either at 10 a.m. or 1 p.m., where we will be discussing personality disorders. If you don't have any questions for me, I'm going to let you go. Take care, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please consult your directory and call again, or ask your operator for assistance. This is a recording.